Welcome to Bloody Violent History. My name is Tom Ashton, and this is the third part of our series on the IED. IED is the acronym for Improvised Explosive Device. In the two previous episodes, I have spoken with Harry Parker, an infantry soldier, and Tom Carroll, a combat surgeon, about their military experiences with particular reference to the IED. Harry Parker was severely injured by an IED in 2009. Tom Carroll served two tours in 2009 and 2012 at Camp Bastion, Afghanistan, where he treated men and women subjected to the devastating injuries caused by the improvised explosive device. Today I'm talking with an ex-soldier who works for the Halo Trust, the NGO specialising in the disarming of mines and IEDs. This episode was recorded before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. IEDs were responsible for 2/3 of the UK Armed Forces casualties in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Minefield engineer. My guest today is a former British Army officer and international aid worker who has cleared landmines and unexploded bombs in the aftermath of war in Africa, Asia and the Middle East. As co-chair of the Cluster Munitions Coalition, he successfully campaigned for an international ban on cluster bombs. He currently serves on the board of directors of the minefield clearance charity, the Halo Trust, and the weapons policy organisation, Article 36. He travels regularly overseas to conflict-afflicted countries. He is also the author of 5 novels, including the 2010 Ian Fleming Steel Dagger winner, A Loyal Spy. Simon Conway, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is mines and minefields, sort of the history, a potted history of why people have used them in conflicts, probably from the Second World War, both land and sea and types and so on. So could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially minefields they're really an area denial weapon. They're to prevent enemy forces from approaching and advancing through positions. They've also been designed specifically to kind of jam up the casualty evacuation chain of militaries, which is why we've seen mines themselves become smaller with a smaller explosive content in them over time, because the intention is not to kill but actually to maim. If you take somebody's foot off, what you're actually doing is creating circumstances in which somebody else has got to pick them up, maybe 2 or 3 people, and they've got to then bundle them back through quite an extensive casualty evacuation chain in order for them to get treatment. So you're not just taking out one person. So that's something to remember about most mines, is they're not intended to kill, they're intended to maim. And of course, that's one of the things that makes them, most of them are, that's one of the things that makes them very, very unpleasant.
Are they more something that's left there than, because I mean, conventional military tactics would be that you would have a minefield and then you would have covering arcs of fire over it, wouldn't you? I mean, that's kind of what we were taught at Sandhurst. That's not the thing with these, exactly. Is it? They're just left there and...
Well, I mean, that's what they were intended for. What's happened really is 2 things. I mean, one is that the nature of warfare has changed. It's become much more mobile. And actually, if you're going to advance or retreat, if you're going to move your forces, the last thing you need are these kind of obstacles that you've created yourself. So in modern warfare, modern mobile warfare, having static minefields is actually often a hindrance. And then the other thing is that most of these weapons were built for the Cold War. They were built for a war that never happened. They were designed, for use, as with many modern systems, on the North European plain or whatever. And actually, what's happened is that they ended up being given often to groups they ended up getting used in developing countries, across the third world, got given to various different factions because, of course, the Cold War wasn't so cold out there in the rest of the world.
So
there was some very bitter conflicts. Yeah, exactly. They get used in proxy wars by irregular militias who don't get taught how to lay them. So they end up being laid in very, very irregular ways that often make no sense. Very rare. I mean, in my 20 plus years of clearing minefields, very few minefields I've cleared that actually have a map. That there was even a map made. I mean, if there was a map made, the process of trying to find it and get hold of it, often, decades after the conflict, can be difficult, but it's possible.
Was that a big contrast to the Second World War when Germans, say, were laying mines? Would they write it all down very carefully, so clearing it up wasn't so difficult at the end of the war?
I think so. My impression is that certainly when the Germans had time, they made good maps that were able to be read, and that aided the clearance afterwards and speeded up the clearance afterwards. I suspect in the latter stages of the conflict, as they were falling back through Germany, I suspect quite a lot of mines were laid without any maps being made because they were done in haste. But I think generally, as a rule, in the Second World War, you saw kind of responsible record keeping.
And I saw that after the war, the Navy actually employed German naval ratings to man minesweepers to sweep up their own mines. I don't know. I'd never heard of that before. So I guess that was putting them to use, which nowadays you wouldn't be able to do, would you?
No, it would be against the law now. But there were about 90,000 German prisoners of war were used to clear landmines after the Second World War, and they cleared millions, tens of millions of mines. I mean, it's kind of interesting. You can, I mean, irrespective of the fact whether it was legal or not, you can argue that one of the reasons that there wasn't an insurgency in Germany after the war was because so many of the soldiers were busy clearing up the mines in that vital kind of 6-month period after Berlin fell. Now, Halo, the organisation I work for, we employ 10,000 people. Now, we don't employ prisoners of war, but we do employ people who've been reintegrated as combatants in a similar kind of role. And of course, it's much safer and done much more effectively than it was back in the Second World War when they did have pretty high casualty rates.
And they would be doing this both willingly and being paid.
Our staff, yes, absolutely, yes. And it's a pretty good job if you're in Afghanistan or in Cambodia or Angola, and you come from a remote community. Mine clearance, demining can offer you a stable income, and we equip all of our deminers with proper body armor, ballistic visors, metal detectors. We've got very well-rehearsed standard operating procedures, and we have very low casualty rates. I think we're on a par with Scottish forestry.
Right. Okay. So, yes, because the certainly the impression, obviously, when you watch a film like The Hurt Locker, is that you're not going to survive very long at all. But I suppose that was a very specific in the middle of a war going on. But
I think Hollywood's always had a problem with mines and bombs. I mean, like for instance, the Hollywood trope of treading on a mine and then it goes off when you lift your foot doesn't happen. It never happens. Basically you tread on it, the pressure plate goes down, that usually frees a space for a spring to hit a detonator, and boom, that's it, you lost your foot. So that there's all sorts of kind of tropes in the movies. I mean, I enjoyed Hurt Locker, but I do know a lot of bomb techs who are kind of fizzing with anger at what they thought was sort of deeply irresponsible behaviour.
It was ever thus, I guess, wasn't it? But back to Halo and also the Ottawa 97. Could you give us a little bit of a idea about the treaties to ban mines?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, during the Cold War, there's absolutely massive use of mines. I mean, they were produced on huge scale and they're used in vast numbers in places like Afghanistan, Cambodia, Angola, Mozambique. Really, I think the country that really highlighted the problem was Afghanistan. I mean, there was a humanitarian crisis caused by huge numbers of mines laid by the Russians, and they were there was a general, sense of outrage at the levels of casualties of ordinary people. This was ordinary people going about their business, blowing themselves up, and often actually young people. I mean, if you look around the world, and it's true today as it was then, it's often curious teenagers. They walk into areas they shouldn't, they pick things up they shouldn't, etc. Curious young boys actually are the most vulnerable group around the world. Absolutely every country you go to, blowing themselves up.
Like those stories of young boys in the Blitz, I mean, in London, running around on bomb sites, I guess,
exactly.
getting hurt.
So you have this humanitarian emergency, and this prompts a couple of things. One is this, the campaign to ban landmines, really to say this is victim-operated landmines are completely unacceptable. And that was extremely successful. We know, for instance, it had people like Jodie Williams who led the campaign. And then, of course, Princess Diana. Princess Diana came to one of our Halo minefields in January 97, and in doing so highlighted the work that we do and the terrible effects of landmines. And that led to the Mine Ban Treaty, which was signed in 1999. And actually it's been an incredibly successful treaty, more than 200 countries signed, and you can't buy landmines on the open market anymore. I mean, they're really hard to get. And that's actually one of the reasons why non-states actors are using IEDs, because they can't get hold of. There's very few countries involved in production. Probably the only one that we really know of that's exporting is Iran, and they're sending mines to Yemen. But I mean, other than that, pretty much a pariah weapon now, and any state that sells them is a pariah state.
So if in conventional military, your platoon is setting up an ambush, you remember you go along the track and then you cut back on yourself and you get your guys. Nowadays, that wouldn't include claymores and mines around to get the guys running away, or is that still allowed?
You can use claymores if they're command detonated.
Right.
So a claymore, it's basically a sheet of explosives with a sheet of ball bearings, and it fires out in an arc ball bearings. If it had a tripwire attached to it, that would be contrary to the Mine Ban Treaty. But if you've got a clacker and there's a person at the end who presses it, then that is not illegal under the Mine Ban Treaty.
Okay.
I mean, I think the thing, in parallel to the Mine Ban Treaty, you get the beginnings of what we call humanitarian landmine clearance. So, and one of the founders of this was Colin Mitchell, Mad Mitch of Aden, who was one of the founders of Halo. He had been, he was in Kabul working for Radio Free Kabul, and he had been in the Second World War. He was familiar with landmine clearance from the Second World War, from Italy, from the campaign in Italy.
Was he SAS or something?
He was an Argyll. He was Argyll and Southern Highlander.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. And interestingly, a lot of Halo people were ex-Highland regiments. So, for instance, I was in the Queensland Highlanders, which is of some relevance to the ambush in my book. Yeah. But Colin was in Kabul and just said, "Look, we can clear this. We can do this. You just need to get down on your hands and knees. Landmine clearance is, it's a bit of it's like a mixture between gardening and archaeology. As long as you've got the kit, you're on your hands and knees. You can clear the mines." And so they started in Kabul in 1988, and that was the sort of founding story of Halo, and the founding story of humanitarian landmine clearance.
So nobody was doing any kind of clearance before that, except when governments decided to do it.
Yeah. It was the first time really that civilians had done it, and there were. I mean, it wasn't just Halo. There were others that were kind of reaching that conclusion at the same time, both within the UN and also within Mines Advisory Group, another British organisation. So, but I think, certainly, I would say probably Halo led the charge on that one. And of course, it's evolved massively from Afghanistan. We then started working in Cambodia. That was the next place, which also, huge numbers of people maimed and injured after the Khmer Rouge had been pushed out of Cambodia by the Vietnamese. the basics are the same, men and women on their hands and knees in body armor with metal detectors, with scrapers and probes and garden shears to cut the vegetation. And there have been some advances. I mean, we're increasingly using dual purpose detectors that have metal detector, but also ground penetrating radar, which speeds up our work. But the technology hasn't dramatically changed. It continues to be labor intensive, so we employ a lot of people. But we employ people from affected communities. And what you find is that they often, their first salary payment usually gets, they obviously interested in educating their kids is obviously a big priority, but they're spending it on seed to plant in the fields that they've just cleared.
Yeah.
So we employ people from those communities, and that fixes the communities. It increases our security. So obviously we're then plugged into whatever's going on, and places like Afghanistan, that's very important still. And it pumps money into local economy. So it has all of it. And then what you find is that other people come on. So we get into a place, no one can go there because there's mines everywhere. We employ local people, clear the mines, and then other aid agencies will arrive. And then at some point the government will arrive, and they'll get a road and they'll get a school. And then they might even appear on a census. You know what I mean? So we find these communities that just don't exist because they're so marginalized, and we transform them, which is really interesting. And you go, I've been back to places 20 years after I was involved in clearing them, and you wouldn't recognize the place. And also, I don't think anyone remembers it ever was a minefield, which is great.
So it really is the banning of mines, because we hear a lot about IEDs and these troubles in Iraq and other places where there are conflicts, but the banning of conventional mines being sold and distributed to people has that knocked 90% of it, or is it now just these other minefields of IEDs? I mean, has the problem gone somewhere else, or has it reduced worldwide this problem massively?
Well, there's very, very, very little fresh mine laying. So what we're doing now is still clearing what was left over. So for instance, in Zimbabwe, we're clearing mines that were laid in 1979, and they are still working, and they are still threatening local communities that live right next door to them, that have to walk through the minefields to get water. We're talking about plastic cased mines that would just seem to go on forever and work really well. So we've got a job of work to do to get those countries finished. But I think you'll find in the next 5 to 10 years quite a different situation, because we're getting close to finishing a number of countries. Sri Lanka, I think, will be finished in the next few years. Zimbabwe. I mean, there are political and economic reasons why sometimes it takes a bit longer than you'd hope. Just the money isn't there to do it, or various political things get in the way. But actually, we within our grasp is getting, is basically clearing the world of landmines. That is possible. I mean, it may be 20 years hence before it's really finished, but it's going to decrease because there isn't fresh mine laying. The exception, of course, is IEDs, and that's where we're seeing, the growth.
Are you able to operate in Afghanistan at the moment?
Yes, in fact, we were. So I was with my colleagues involved in getting the last of our internationals out back whenever it was, the day that Kabul fell. We got them out back in August, and we were back at work within 6 days. We got a request from the Taliban to go and clear unexploded ordnance from around Kunduz, the city in the north, and we deployed a team up there, and we have. Basically, I think the full complement is now back at work in Afghanistan of our national staff, and that's, I think, about 3,000 staff.
That's encouraging on two parts. I mean, one, that the Taliban have, recognised how important it is for you to carry on doing this work, and by the sound of it, want you to do it, but also that they trust you and they don't think you're, working for another government.
I mean, so we've been in Afghanistan since 1988. The program is run by a very well-respected Afghan who's a medical doctor. We work all across the country, and we hire people from all different ethnic groups, and it's very much an Afghan organisation. There were a few internationals in there, but they were basically helping really with sort of donor relations. We have we've been able to work within Taliban-controlled areas for quite some time, and we worked through the Taliban the last time. I mean, we were working there, when 9/11 happened.
But probably not with Daesh and Al-Qaeda, people like that.
No, they are a problem, absolutely, as they are for the Taliban. But yeah, we're working there. It helps that in the late 90s, Mullah Omar issued a fatwa against landmines, and that actually gave us the framework within which to have discussions with the Taliban about it. And we maintained contact with them over the years. We were able to pass messages if we needed to, to ask permission for access to areas. And so we have a pretty good relationship with them. And the thing, I think the most heartening thing is that they are keen for us to clear IEDs, because what's causing casualties in Afghanistan at the moment are victim-operated improvised explosive devices that have been left behind.
So farmers treading on them in the fields.
Farmers, women collecting water. So we've very much switched our emphasis towards clearing IEDs, which is what we wanted to do, but it was problematic before because many of them were essentially in conflict, as in they were still in use. And that's the thing that distinguishes us from military IED clearance. We don't clear under fire. We clear after the conflict, or when the conflict has moved away from an area. So if there's an active IED, we're not going to touch it. But if, for instance, Taliban say that these areas, they're all they're no longer in use, please go ahead, get rid of them, then great. And obviously the local populace is they're over the moon. They're happy to get rid of them, frankly.
Yeah, well, maybe we should come on specifically to the IED, the improvised explosive device. And as well as doing the work you do, Simon, you also are a novelist writing fiction. Would you say thrillers? Is that how you would designate them? And I've just read a chapter on your book, The Stranger, which is about an ambush in Basra in Iraq. And here is a reading from that chapter from Simon Conway's book, The Stranger. MI6 officer Jude Lyon reviews the Basra ambush file.
Ground forces from the Special Reconnaissance Regiment were approaching on the road from the south in a convoy of Humvees and souped-up Land Rovers. As the Pumas put down and the assault teams disembarked, events began to run rapidly out of control. A child carrying what looked like a baby wrapped in a blanket ran out of the farmhouse at the centre of the compound towards the approaching SAS troopers. He detonated the bomb too early to kill any of the soldiers, but one of the Pumas was so low, about 50 feet, that the explosion caused the helicopter to lose control. It was blown upwards on a cushion of blast, and then, for a split second, it dropped like a stone. Against the odds, the pilot managed to recover control briefly enough to perform a hard landing that resulted in a concussion and several fractures, but no fatalities. The explosion acted as a lure and an accelerant. Caught in the open between the helicopters and the building, the soldiers responded as expected. They charged. Jude is hunched against the monitor, watching a feed from one of the lynxes, listening to the agitated commentary of the pilot and the shouts and barked commands of the soldiers as they break into the building and begin clearing the ground floor rooms. The explosion whites out the screen. 4 SAS soldiers died in the blast. Jude pauses the video feed and enlarges the post-blast analysis report. It was conducted by an ammunition technical officer named Franklin, who recorded the events in clipped sentences packed with acronyms. He concluded that the bomb was at least 1,000 kilograms in weight, and based on swabs recovered from the scene, made of a plasticized mixture of ammonium nitrate and aluminium paste. The bomb was located under the main stairwell and connected by means of an insulated copper wire to a radio-controlled firing switch situated in a sandy hollow about 80 metres northeast of the building, just outside the range of the task force's electronic countermeasures, the jammers that provided a bubble of safety, overwhelming any signal being transmitted. An attached sketch map shows a second wire running from the firing point to the grove of king palms just south of a farmhouse adjacent to where the helicopters landed. Jude switches back to the video feeds. 3 explosions in quick succession like popcorn puffing up on the video screen. Improvised directional fragmentation mines, packed full of shipyard confetti that on detonation eject overlapping cones of thousands of shards of molten metal. The nearest Puma was shredded. The pilot and loadmaster died instantly. The co-pilot was blinded. Another Puma was too damaged to take off again. The next bombs went off as the convoy approached the farm compound through the date plantation. They were initiated by a passive infrared switch that detected the heat of the lead vehicle's engine and fired shaped charges, concave copper discs packed with explosives, buried 150 metres apart under the road. The explosives transformed the discs into fist-sized projectiles of molten copper, travelling at well over 1 kilometre a second. They punched straight through the tarmac. The first penetrated the underbelly of a Humvee, killing the driver and one of the passengers in the back and slicing off the legs of the commander in the front passenger seat. The second went off just behind the rear vehicle in the convoy, flipping it over and dumping it in the ditch beside the road. After that, the assault came to a sudden halt. Everybody was frozen in place, denied permission to land and extract casualties. The helicopters soon ran out of flight time and were recalled. The surviving soldiers did their best to keep their wounded comrades alive and hunkered down in the dust to wait. It was dawn before a high-risk search team from Joint Forces EOD group began to breach into the compound. Their work was painstakingly slow. Their first discovery was a bomb made of a stack of 6 artillery rounds in a culvert just outside the compound gates. The second, a fragmentation mine that had failed to detonate in the palm grove beside the hulks of the 3 downed Puma helicopters. An X-ray of the charge revealed that it was booby-trapped. The mine was linked by means of fishing wire and a Soviet-era MUV tripwire switch to a second, more deeply buried mine. In each case, the searchers called forward an IED technician to render the devices safe and then moved on. They opened up a route to the smoking ruin of the main house and around it until they found the command wire that led from the back of the house to the sandy hollow. Rather than follow it, they bounced along the wire, coming in at it from right angles at irregular intervals. 5 pressure plate improvised devices with crush bead necklaces designed to explode when stepped on were discovered beside the path. As soon as they were rendered safe, the team began to gather forensic evidence from the firing point in the hollow, including the circuit board that acted as the bomb's firing circuit and an Indian copy of a Nokia phone used as the receiver. Next, the point of initiation, a recently dug trench beside a small jetty alongside the Euphrates, another 100 metres beyond the firing point. In the bottom of the trench they found another phone, the transmitter, and several cigarette butts. By this time it was noon, and the air was hot enough to strip paint. The commanding officer of 2 Para had arrived by Lynx and established an incident command point 2 kilometres south of the compound, at a crossroads from where he had coordinated the deployment of a cordon, 2 platoons of reinforcements in a rough semicircle on the outer edge of the plantation and a third on the far bank of the Euphrates, a wasteland of dried mud banks and deserted marsh Arab villages that had been the bombers' escape route. Once the cordon was secured, he began the extraction of casualties through the safe lanes opened up by the searchers. The final bomb went off beneath the centre of the crossroads just as a Puma was lifting off, carrying 5 of the wounded. It was as large as the bomb in the farmhouse and contained almost no metallic components. Forensics recovered fragments of a plastic casing and a barometric pressure switch from the crater. The explosion killed 9 soldiers, 2 from the parachute regiment, including their commanding officer, 2 pilots from the Army Air Corps, and 5 wounded SAS troopers. Jude reads a transcript by a major from 2 Para who was on the scene soon after the explosion and described body parts scattered over the road and hanging from the rotor blades of the helicopter. A photo shows the entire area as a mass of twisted, dust-covered metal, shattered glass and debris. All that was recovered of the colonel was a single epaulette that was taken from the scene by the commander of British forces in Iraq and shown to the cabinet a few days later at a security briefing in 10 Downing Street.
Is that an amalgam of a number of incidents, or did something as dramatic as that pretty much happen in Iraq? I mean, is that something that would be that? It seemed very sophisticated.
I mean, I think what distinguishes it is that it's very sophisticated. So the weapons that are used were all, you know, I've seen all of them in either Syria or Iraq, but I would say that the sophistication of the ambush itself was actually much more inspired by the Troubles, by Northern Ireland, actually, by Warren Point specifically. So there was an ambush at Warren Point in August 1979, which caused the biggest loss of life to the British Army in the Troubles. I mean, 18 were killed, I think 20 were injured, including one of the killed was the commanding officer of my regiment, the Queensland Highlanders, the regiment that I would later join. And what was distinct about that was that there were 2 explosions. One, the first explosion, and then what they'd done is that they'd identified where the army was likely to set up the incident control point. And so 30 minutes after the first detonation, once the army had predictably set up their incident control point and were managing the evacuation of casualties, and a helicopter was taking off from the incident control point, they set off the second explosion, and that killed. I mean, 2/3 of those who died were in that detonation, and so that was about, you know, what for me it was about trying to work out, you know, given all the ingredients that the different types of IEDs that I'd seen in Syria but also in Iraq, was what would happen if you took someone with first world military skills and really planned a deadly ambush. So that was what it was based on. But there's certainly, I mean, I you know, there were communities, there were areas of there were villages in Syria, for instance, where there were IEDs had been laid with interlocking arcs, directional fragmentation, you know. So yes, certainly they were no strangers to ambush.
So IEDs, the mines are banned, IEDs kind of develop out of that. They have to make their own. How do they differ? Are they considered different by the Ottawa Treaty? Are they a different thing, or are they the same thing, essentially just a homemade version and that's it?
I think for most of what we find, they're essentially the same thing, just not very well made, actually. And potentially a bit more unstable. As I say, I was in Syria in 2015, I was in Fallujah in Iraq in 2017, and I saw IEDs that were exactly the same design, you know, 650 kilometers apart, the length of the Euphrates Valley. And it's pretty clear that Daesh were using a kind of standard design, which they were either distributing on paper or a CD-ROM or whatever, but that they were and that they were being built to that. And when I say a standard design, we're talking about an electrical circuit with 4 elements: a container full of explosives, could well be homemade explosives, often ammonium nitrate with aluminium paste, a detonator, something to blow up the explosives, a 9-volt battery,
and some shrapnel,
and then a switch.
Yeah.
Sorry?
And some shrapnel, some bits of shrapnel.
Well, yes, added extra, frankly. But yeah, so container, detonator, battery, and then a switch, which would be a pressure plate, usually. That's what we tend to find in huge numbers. And if the pressure plate gets, you know, pushed down, you get a metal circuit connecting, and the battery, you know, the electrical current sets off the detonator, boom, the container explode. So pressure plate activated IEDs. I mean, it's the same basic principle as a landmine, except that it's deconstructed. It's got the innards on the outside usually. So rather than everything being sealed in a nice small plastic, these days they're plastic, but bakelite or metal, but in a sealed container, the bits tend to be on the outside. That means actually that they're much more likely to fail because of ingress, particularly of moisture. So rain's going to really mess with most IEDs, and they'll fray and come apart. So I think it's of course it's very difficult to predict the life of a 9-volt battery, but it is not the case that, as per Zimbabwe, we're going to be clearing IEDs, 50 years later or 40 years later. We're not going to be. Most of these IEDs are not going to be working in 5 years.
So why are the mines in Angola still active? Because they don't have an active circuit. They're a passive circuit, are they? Or something?
Yeah, they're usually passive circuit, and they're usually just literally rely upon downward pressure
and a firing cap.
And most of them are sealed. They're sealed. Particularly the plastic ones. They're very well sealed against the elements, which is not the case with most IEDs. So we're most of what we're finding are frankly victim-operated IEDs. We're not finding very many command wire detonated IEDs. I mean, obviously we have drills for clearing those, and we have detectors that can find, single strands of copper wire. But because it's significantly after the conflict, we're tending not to find them. And of course, and whoever laid them tends to move them, whereas victim-operated ones, they tend to leave behind, which is why that's what we're finding. And also we don't find that much in the way of booby traps. There was a lot of talk about Iraq being entirely full of booby traps, and Syria too. And actually, I don't think that's really materialized. I mean, the stories that sort of, there were booby trapped children's toys and Qurans and things, I think we're a bit, I'm not saying that there weren't any, but there was a lot of chat about that. When in fact, what we've really found is just thousands and thousands and thousands of IEDs, either just simple high explosive charges or directional fragmentation with lots of shipyard confetti, lots of shrapnel to maim and injure. And then the other thing is they tend to have larger containers, more explosives, so they do tend to kill rather than, or very badly injure, rather than the kind of precision you saw with smaller landmines.
And what, in your experience, Simon, is the sort of morale effect on the local civilians and even the local law enforcement and government people? I mean, that to me, throughout this whole thing, seems to be the soldiers on patrol. I interviewed Harry Parker, and I got the feeling, it all felt dangerous, obviously, but the mine thing felt most dangerous to him. I got that impression, that background feeling of at any moment.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that there is, and we're talking, the people that I come across are, ordinary civilians, basically. They're just people going about their business, they're trying to cultivate their land, or, take their kids to school, or herding cattle or buffalo or whatever. And so, there's a level of anxiety that you end up having to live with, which is sometimes can be quite hard to see, actually, because there's so many other things. You go to Afghanistan and, they're just used to so many different ways in which their lives could be ruined. But then, if you speak to families where someone's trodden on a mine or whatever, and they're particularly amputees, and you see how families have been absolutely devastated, and if it's the main breadwinner who is injured or killed, then that then can plunge a family into pretty desperate straits. And then if they're living with an amputee, they're going to live with that forever. If somebody's been blinded, etc. The impact on families is pretty bad. And there is, yes, I think there is this sense of of anxiety. I certainly remember, I mean, personally, I remember a sense of anxiety as a patrol commander and, platoon commander on patrol in West Belfast back in the day. Just that, that horrible sense that something might happen out of the blue and that, you might lose some of your soldiers, that you'd feel responsible for that. And, so I know.
Do you think we were quite well, as best as you can be, prepared for this, given our experience in Ireland?
I'm not sure that we were. I don't think we would have deployed down to Helmand in the way that we did if we'd really learned the lessons.
But what about today? I was looking at your landmine-free policy document for 2025. Is that a HALO document, or is that a general document?
It's a broader document. So we're working alongside Mines Advisory Group, and there are a number of other organisations that have endorsed it.
There seem to be in amongst it the trends of the 4 trends that are identified in it. There's more sort of going on in towns and cities. There's non-state armed groups, the Daesh and so on that we've talked about. The complex geographical pockets of conflict, everything's itty-bitty, and so you might find yourself stepping into an active environment when you're trying to operate as HALO in a non-active environment. And lastly, people dealing with legacy issues of minefields going all the way back to the 70s, as you've described. But then we've got ongoing and new minefields, and trying not to sort of distinguish between the two, but treat them all as one and the same.
And part of my job within HALO is getting new projects off the ground, getting new programs started, and I've been and HALO, in a sense, we came a bit late to the Middle East. We had a big operation in Afghanistan, but we really only started engaging in 2015. And we set up projects fairly rapidly, and I was involved in this in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and then again in Libya. And what was really interesting is the urbanization of warfare. It's been really interesting to see the extent to which warfare's moved into the cities. And I visited a number of absolutely trashed cities across the Middle East and North Africa, and then also actually in the Philippines, Marawi, an absolutely smashed city that Daesh had held.
And do you have to clear those of mines in the same way? Are they littered with mines in the rubble?
Yeah, in some cases they are, and we'd had some experience of that in that we'd cleared Kabul of the sort of smashed up bits of Kabul in the mid-90s, but that was brick. And we put the whole thing through. I mean, basically, West Kabul was put through a rock crusher, and it trashed, destroyed the mines and all the bricks. And you go there now, and it's kind of, it's you wouldn't know. And then we did something similar in Sri Lanka in 2002, 2003.
Do the mines blow up when you go through the rock crusher?
A big industrial rock crusher will easily chew up mines, and if they detonate, it won't really impact the grinders. We do have usually there's a conveyor belt with a metal detector on it. So if you get larger pieces of ordnance, we can pull them out and take them out, and then let the thing continue to run. But I mean, essentially, we're using mechanical equipment these days. So excavators, loaders. So we're armoring them up, usually commercial ones that we're armoring ourselves, and then getting into the rubble, and also cranes, so rock crushers. I mean, the problem we've got now is concrete with rebar, these sort of piles of concrete with rebar, and there could well be IEDs in there. There could be vehicle-borne IEDs. You could have people with suicide vests on, just the corpses, and it's all bundled in there, and you've got to kind of unpick the whole thing. But yeah, we tend to do that mechanically, and in fact, in Iraq, where we're digging up IEDs, we're mostly using excavators with a long boom and a rake on the end, and the rake digs up the IED, and then an operator moves forward and renders it safe. So we're reducing the risk to the operator clearing the IED. So cities is a big issue for us, and also just that distinction between conflict and post-conflict seems to have blurred now, where we're often working in places that are, be it Yemen or Libya, where there's some extent of conflict going on, and we may have to be quite mobile in terms of shifting where we work.
So you might find yourself in a place, clear it of the mines, and then 3 years you're back there doing the same job again?
Yeah, sometimes. I think it's sort of fairly rare because it tends to be sort of different things happen. But yeah, sometimes. But what you do hopefully have after your 3 years is a capacity to do it properly and effectively and quickly. I often think it's better for us to build a clearance capacity during conflict, because when conflicts end, they tend to end very quickly, and you tend to see these huge spikes in casualties. I mean, Afghanistan at the moment, there's more than 1 million people on the move trying to get back to their homes now, and they're walking into situations where they don't know, they don't know if there are IEDs in their fields, in their houses, whatever. If you can build the capacity to clear those very swiftly, then you can reduce the casualties. So you need to start that process before the conflict ends.
Is it that these people who are on the move, but they haven't settled into their everyday life, that you can co-opt them at this stage to help you do this work and to organise their local societies in a way that you can come in and clear this stuff for them, and then they can start farming? Is that the idea?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we're talking about internally displaced people that have had to flee their homes. Well, suddenly, conflict's over. They want to return home. It's very understandable. So what we need to do is try and clear ahead of them. Now, in some cases, yes, they can form part of the clearance effort, but having skilled personnel that can get in quick in that moment after conflict, when people are moving, when you see these huge movements of people, that's absolutely vital, because that's when every conflict, every situation that I've been in the last 20 years, that you've seen this big spike in immediate post-conflict situation.
Looking to the future, both for Halo and what you do, and also what's going on with IEDs, without giving away any secrets or ideas, what do you think is going to happen for the future? Perhaps starting with, detection and cleaning these. You call them contaminated areas, do you? Is that what a mine?
Yes.
Yeah. What's coming down the line for being able to protect the people who are doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been through a period of several years where the drone was going to be the answer to everything.
Our podcast on drones is coming out tonight, which is this is before Christmas for recording this. So.
What's interesting is we really are beginning to see results now, actually. So we're using detectors using ground penetrating radar and LiDAR mounted on drones, which we are effectively using to locate mines. The point is that we're able to attach detectors that can work at a certain height. You don't have to be right against the ground. That is allowing us to, based on temperature differences in the soil, identify the locations of mines. Now that is working quite well in Somaliland, where it's and in Angola, but we're talking about kind of flat savanna or desert. It's going to be a long time before you can use a drone to find mines in thick vegetation in Cambodia, for instance. So I think there was a lot of hope for drones, and I think it's definitely we're beginning to see some options there.
And the IEDs themselves, they are what they are. They're not growing in any great sophistication. They're just a bloody awful thing, and simplicity is they're probably their best ticket, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, from the ones that we're finding have usually got large amounts of metal in them, and they've certainly got a battery, and batteries are pretty easy to detect. So we're not having difficulties detecting IEDs, which doesn't mean to say that there may not come a time when there are much more sophisticated IEDs out there. And I think that things like 3D printing pose a fairly significant risk.
Yes.
And a lot of it, a lot of this stuff relies upon the imagination of the people that use them. What was so horrifying about that attack at Warren Point was that the IRA had, they thought about it. They thought about where the British Army would put an incident control point. And so, you never have to you should never rule out the imagination of your enemies, that they might develop some, and then you're in trouble. For the most part, they don't. But then, the resources with things like 3D printing, it does mean that there'll be greater resources. I mean, for us, I think the big technological change will be to do with detection, because at the moment, most of our work is, we spend a lot of time digging up bits of metal or things that are kind of the shape of, even with
on your hands and knees.
Radar, they're not always, it's hands and knees work. They're not always getting it right. You're exploring a lot of duds, and you can't risk, you have to clear pretty much everything because the last thing you want to do is clear 90% of the mines. Someone's got to build a school on the land that we hand over. Yeah. This isn't like military clearance is about punching a hole through a minefield and charging through it and attacking the enemy. For us, it's about getting every single mine.
Decontamination.
It's decontamination. Yeah. So it has to be foolproof. If one mine gets left behind, it discredits everything we do. So we need reliable means of detection that cuts out all the clutter, that cuts out the bits of metal, the bits of barbed wire, the bullets, the usual rubbish that you find anywhere under the ground, that cuts out the stones that are the shape of a mine. That you can get all of that stuff out the way so that you can actually find the mines. Yeah, and then it's just a question of clearing them. And I mean, people get very concerned about the safety of deminers, as they should be, but actually statistically, we're pretty low casualty rates, actually, very, very low, actually, very low. So it's not, my concern is always the safety of our staff, but improving their safety by 2% is not going to kind of make a material difference.
Yes,
whereas improving our detection of items would make a significant difference and speed us up.
And I was reading one piece on, I think maybe it's in that same report, where there was a time where people were so cautious about where mines were and minefields that it was incredibly slow cleaning and clearing, and because they basically said this entire country is covered in mines, we have to proceed at a snail's pace. So there is a very clear risk assessment and taking of a certain amount of risk to get it done versus never getting it done. So
survey is absolutely a key part of what we do. But absolutely, and one of the things I think Halo does best actually is identifying the locations of suspect areas and properly delineating them, creating the boundaries to them. Because we clear, it costs a certain amount of money per square meter. The more that we can hone down the area and identify exactly where the danger area is, then the easier our task is, the cheaper it will be, the quicker we can get it done. And we don't end up wasting time clearing areas that don't have any mines in. Because the last thing any of us want to be doing is literally clearing areas that have got nothing in them.
You're ploughing the field for them.
Time and money.
Yeah. But in these sort of asymmetric conflicts that we seem to get into without any idea about how we're going to either resolve them or get out of them nowadays, that does seem to create this situation where you have a lot of IEDs spread randomly throughout a large area, sort of distributed minefield. So identifying, as you've just been describing, it must be very hard, much harder than it was before, because they're just all over the place, here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah, and that is really difficult. I mean, it's not unprecedented. I mean, the way that the Khmer Rouge laid mines in Cambodia was we call it nuisance mining. I mean, literally they just lay them randomly, a few here and there, because nobody taught them how to do it, and also just our badness. I think so nuisance laying is really problematic because it blocks much larger areas because you just don't know where's safe and where's not. And it's the sort of thing we have seen Daesh doing. Particularly those kind of nihilist groups, the ones that glorify death.
They don't care.
They don't care. They don't care, and that is very problematic because there's no pattern. You know, you're trying to work out what, you know, where the hell to clear. And often, I mean, the sad thing is often, you know, you work out where they are because there's been casualties in that area.
And how you're dealing with this, and there's this long tail of injury and death, but particularly the injuries. Who's the sort of halo? Do you have sort of cousins in the NGO world that help deal with that side of things?
Well, we have. So, I mean, there are organisations like International Committee of the Red Cross, for instance, that's very that does a lot of work with victim assistance, survivor assistance, particularly the provision of prosthetics. There are other organisations like Handicap International, French-based organisation. We don't, as an organisation, generally do prosthetics. We do that side of things, but we work in partnership with organisations that do. We are engaged in what we call explosive ordnance risk education. So actually, you know, going to schools, going to talk to, you know, scrap workers, people that are vulnerable, and try and, you know, kind of encourage them not to pick things up, that or teach them how to, you know, scrap workers, try and teach them so that they know what they're looking at, not to touch. And with kids, it's very much, you know, don't touch, don't go in these areas.
And is there anything you can do when these sort of things kick off proactively? I mean, it seems perhaps absurd, but that if people are involved in these conflicts, tossing these mines out and these IEDs, from your experience?
I think you should never close off negotiation. You know, you should always be trying to talk. You know, you might be doing that quietly behind the scenes, but if you can do that, then you can at least pass on messages. And there are organisations. I mean, there are organisations that work on dialogue with you know, some of these groups in order to try and encourage them to use some of the kind of norms to obey some of the laws of war, to avoid weapons that cause unnecessary suffering to civilians, particularly,
or even cause them problems down the line.
Yeah. So I think you do have to do. You know, you have to do that. There's no point sort of standing on the sidelines sort of condemning. I mean, you can do that. And you may make yourself feel better, but at the end of the day, we have to find ways of engaging with these groups and saying to them that you can't, you know, don't do that. But in some cases, you know, you can't. You know, Daesh is pretty difficult to have a conversation with.
I should really ask, how do you make your money? How do you raise your money, Halo? How do you do that?
Yeah, so most of our money comes from international government donors. So the United States Department of State, the German Federal Foreign Office, UK Foreign and Commonwealth, FCDO, the new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Irish government, the Finnish government, the Japanese, the Dutch are big donors. So
you get anything from the Russians or the Chinese?
We don't get any money from the Russians or the Chinese, and I think it's a shame that the Russians haven't made any significant contribution to clearance, because I've spent so much of my career clearing up old Soviet ordnance, so that's a bit frustrating. I mean, they do the odd bit here and there in Syria, but it feels mostly for show, to be honest. And the Chinese, the Chinese never really engaged on this one. Both countries say that they abide by the Mine Ban Treaty. They haven't signed it, but they say that they abide by it. Yes. And that's one of the other interesting things about the treaty itself. I mean, America, China, and Russia haven't signed.
Yeah, I think I saw America, because it's to do with Korea, isn't it? That they want to be able to have a minefield in Korea, something like that.
Well, they're not even their minefields, actually. I mean, under jurisdiction for the mines in Korea is with South Korea, but the Mine Ban Treaty means that you're not allowed to act in an alliance with a nation that's using landmines. So the US argument is that they can't operate with the South Koreans, you know, as signatories to the Mine Ban Treaty. But what they do say is that out with the Korean Peninsula, they don't use mines, and I don't think they haven't produced, manufactured, or laid any mines since the late 90s. I mean, since the mine ban, campaign began, actually. So and they're the biggest donor to mine clearance in the world. So it's going to be an interesting one. It's interesting about how that you can create you can stigmatize a weapon to the point where even countries that haven't signed a treaty adhere to it.
They're going to get a lot of pressure if they start messing around too much.
Exactly. There's only been the US has only ever they reported it. There's only ever been one report of a mine being used, and I think this is post 97, and I think it was in Afghanistan sometime post 2001. There was one mine, and I suspect what it was, going back to your earlier point, it was probably a claymore that got rigged for a tripwire rather than command, and then got left behind.
All right.
And they reported it up through the chain of the international treaty that they haven't signed.
Yes.
It's quite an interesting
confession.
Little footnote. Interesting little footnote.
Down to the details. But that one mine is a whole family and is a whole life, isn't it? Somewhere along the line, if somebody gets hit by it. Well, before we close, Simon, is there anything else you'd like to sort of say about IEDs or the work you do, or minefields or mines or any of this subject?
Just to say how incredibly fulfilling it's been, actually, interestingly. I mean, I've been reflecting a bit back on my career recently and about how that I spoke about it earlier, but that business about communities being transformed and the ability to go back, years later and go and look at them and see that it's all changed. They've got roads and 4G. Nobody even remembers there was ever a minefield there. And that's great. That's very fulfilling. And I think
it sounds like that sort of should be talked about a bit, because we only really hear about the terrible disasters and dramas in the world, And I was listening to a thing about Africa yesterday, and people tend to write the entire continent off as a basket case, and it's not at all. There are places that are making progress, and but we hear about the disasters. So.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be in this business if I wasn't an optimist. I mean, you just get crushed.
Yes.
You get crushed. You've got to be sort of like, I am an optimist, whatever.
Yeah. Well,
I'm going to keep at this until, and we are, I mean, the landmine free thing, it's entirely feasible.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there's going to be a problem with IEDs, but as I said before, they're not going to survive forever. We're not going to have a repeat of the problem that we had in the 1980s and 1990s. That will not come around again. So we've got an opportunity. If as long as governments are prepared to fund this, then and I would say it's good funding, it's good aid, actually, because it as I said, it has this it generates all sorts of other impacts. And it employs people. They plant their fields, they educate their kids. Because we employ a lot of people, we have very broad-ranging impact, and we're also able to work in places where other people can't, because our security networks are so good, because we've got so many local people on the books. They generally warn us what's going on.
Fantastic.
So I think, as long as governments continue to understand that this is good aid, then I think that we can reach the point where most of the world will be free of landmines and IEDs, and then we just need a capacity to deal with new ones as they come along. But I think that will be quite specific and targeted.
That is a good note to end on, because a lot of it's been quite tough to listen to these last 3 episodes. So thank you, Simon, for talking to us about mines and the IED. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
So it goes. This is the concluding episode of our 3-part series on the IED. I hope you found it informative. Details of Harry and Simon's books are shown in the show notes. Please pass this podcast on to a friend to help spread the word. You can contact me at talk@bloodyviolenthistory.com. Thank you, and good luck.